Let's get to this campaign now, which is tackling the issues around trans inclusion and transphobia in the game. Football versus Transphobia Week of Action concludes today with the Transgender Day of Visibility. I'm delighted to say that Natalie Washington is the lead for this campaign, and she joins us now. Look, good afternoon to you, Natalie. Tell us more about this campaign then and what you're trying to achieve.
Thank you. Yeah, great to be with you. So Football v Transphobia started, we're in our third year, and really it's about drawing attention to the issues facing transgender people in being involved in football. So that's at every level and in every type of role. So trans people are in football, have always been in football. But what we're trying to say is that, you know, there are specific issues that affect our participation, but also like there are trans people doing great things in the game already, and we want to draw attention to that. And linking this with Trans Day of Visibility is about kind of showing that the game is enriched by trans people's presence, and we're about kind of drawing attention to that.
Yeah, look, how difficult or easy was it for you to play football as a trans woman then?
It's difficult. I think there's a lot of misconceptions around that people have probably seen around trans people's participation in football, and it affects trans women and trans feminine people particularly. So for me personally, you know, the way that I was able to play football was I actually stopped for a year when I first transitioned because I thought, I'm not going to be able to be involved in this game anymore. And then I actually, you know, watched the Women's World Cup in Canada in 2015, and I was inspired to get back into it. And so I reached out to some clubs, found out what the FA policy was, and actually, you know, I wasn't able to play for 18 months after I first tried to join because there's certain criteria that have to be met, and it took me a while to meet that. Okay. And that's not an unusual experience, but of course people face all sorts of different barriers as well, and you know, depending on your gender identity and depending on the kind of the level of sport you're playing at, the barriers can be different. But for me it was a hugely kind of affirming activity, and it was hugely important to my mental health, to my access to social groups, to my physical health. There's so many benefits that come from involvement in sport that I know from speaking to trans people this week that they really, really benefit from. And, you know, we're really about making sure that everyone gets access to that.
Yeah, it sounds brilliant. How important has the football community then been in supporting your challenges?
Do you know, I mean, it's easy to think that sometimes the football community can be unsupportive around these things, but we've had a real wealth of support this week from all over the game at all levels. So, you know, we've had some Premier League football clubs tweeting about supporters they have from their LGBT supporters group who have got involved with football, supporting them. We've had tweets from the EFL. We've had grassroots clubs talking about trans inclusion. There are teams in the GFSN, which is a sort of an LGBT football league as well, talking about trans inclusion. So at every level of the game and in every type of role, and I think it's important to say it's every type of role as well. It's easy to focus on what goes on the pitch, but there are trans people, many trans people in the stands, you know, who have mixed feelings sometimes about attending games, but you know, we've heard from people that have felt empowered to go back. There are people in boardrooms, all sorts of roles, and at every level. And I think, you know, awareness is growing amongst sort of football community in general, that actually football is not always a welcoming place for everyone. And I think as awareness grows about that point in general, you know, trans people are obviously part of that.
Yeah, you make a really good point there. How much more difficult then has it been this year in particular without the visibility at games, with the absence of fans?
It's a real mixed bag actually. So I mean, obviously this year, and in fact last year, you know, as I said, we've been going for 3 years and 2 of those have been entirely virtual. It's a mixed bag because for the trans community in general, we've always been quite, you know, restricted to the internet because we're a very tiny minority within a tiny minority, and so therefore in order to find community we've had to use virtual means. So that's not unusual, but what has really been tricky is Football v Transphobia is part of Football v Homophobia campaign, and a lot of that has always been about doing visible campaigns on match days, you know, having people in the stands with flags and so on, and we've seen some of that stuff still going on, but it has been a real barrier. You know, for example, we have a group of sort of trans players that I speak to occasionally, and most of us have never actually played a game of football together because we only got together sort of in the last 2 or 3 years, and we just haven't been able to. And that's the sort of thing that is a barrier. And also, I think what's important is that, as I touched on earlier, that access to our football clubs is often our access to our community. Football clubs are very rooted in their local community, and without access to that, sometimes people don't speak to people for a long period of time. They don't have access to their friends, and that's a real barrier for a demographic that is adversely affected by social isolation and bad mental health as well.
Yeah. Another good point you make. Look, this is obviously, as you mentioned there, the third year of this campaign. How much progress do you think, just finally, has been made in that time, and how are you measuring progress?
So, I mean, there's a few metrics. I mean, part of it at the moment is really about raising visibility. You know, a lot of people just don't even think about the concept of transgender and non-binary people in football. So we're here talking about this now, right? So that's a great step. I've spoken to numerous trans and non-binary people this week who have got back into football, and there's someone who I've been talking to all week who is just going to their first training session for years tonight, and that's the sort of that tangible progress about getting people feeling that they can get back into the game. They can go to their local club, they can go to go and watch a game at their local club. Those sorts of things are really tangible. I'm seeing, I said, we're a small minority within a small minority, so the numbers we're talking are small, but I'm seeing more and more people feeling able to do that, and I'm seeing a much more mature conversation, still not mature enough, but a much more mature conversation in the national sphere around what is transphobia, what does it look like, and what are the ways in which transphobic language or any other kind of discriminatory language fits into the wider whole. Because typically transphobic language is very rooted in misogyny, it's very rooted in homophobia. So what hurts us typically hurts large portions of the rest of the population as well. And having a mature conversation about that is really, really important.